morning and welcome to the January 25th, 2022 Board of Police Commissioners meeting. We acknowledge that we are on traditional lands of the Treaty 4 territory, a treaty signed with 35 First Nations across southern Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta and Manitoba, and the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. In the absence of a chairperson and vice chairperson, I'd like to call the meeting to order. The first order of business is the appointment of chairperson for 2022. Could I have nominations, please?
I wanted to nominate the Worship Senator Masters.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, congratulations, Mayor Masters. You have been chosen as chairperson for the Board of Police Commissioners for 2022 by acclamation. Please take the chair.
Thank you very much. I will note that no other members of the commission showed up here today to chair the meeting, so that should have been my sign. Hey, guys. Welcome. The next order of business is choosing a vice chairperson, and I'll ask for nominations for vice chairperson. I would nominate Jada Yee. Jada, would you accept and allow your name to stand for vice chair? I know you're not making eye contact with me right now. I see it.
I gladly accept. Thank you.
Any other nominations? All right, well then, congratulations, Jada Yee. You've been chosen vice chair of the Board of Police Commissioners by acclamation. Most members of the board are attending the meeting today through video conferencing. I'd like to remind those members who are attending of the following. This is the same old spiel, guys. Ensure your video camera and microphone are turned off. If a member of the board wishes to speak, use the raised hand function to be placed in the speaking queue. And when speaking, remember to unmute your microphone as well as enable your video camera. Can I have a motion to approve the public agenda?
I'll make the motion.
Thank you very much. I'll call the question. Anyone opposed? So carried. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes from the meeting held on December 14th, 2021? Just need a motion to approve. Thank you, Councillor Bresciani. Thank you, Councillor Bresciani. Any errors or omissions? Hearing none, I'll call the question. Anyone opposed? Carried. Our first report is PO 22-1 Regina Police Service Sexual Assault Investigation Policy. Chief, I'm going to ask that you introduce this and the presenter today. One moment. Gotcha. There you go.
Great. Thank you very much, Mayor Masters, and good morning. Members of the board, welcome back for 2022. And Commissioner Duncan, welcome. We're glad to have you aboard and look forward to working with you this year. So yeah, this first report is one that we're bringing to the public session of the Board of Police Commissioners to talk about the work that we've been doing with regard to sexual assault investigations and some really progressive enhancements that we've been able to make over the last couple of years with regard to some oversight that I know has incredibly been a positive impact on not only our investigations, but I think as importantly, the service that we deliver to survivors of sexual assaults. Staff Sergeant Chris Jacque is with us today. Chris has been involved intimately with this program over the last couple of years. In fact, has transferred out of the area, but has maintained carriage of the file because of, well, we asked him if he was interested in it, but his personal passion in this and the work that he's done really has helped us move this to the next level. So I'm happy to turn this over to Staff Sergeant Jacque now, who will walk you through this report.
Good afternoon, Mayor Masters and board members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity again to speak to you today about our recently developed and implemented sexual assault investigation policy, checklist, training, and trauma-informed interview guidelines. The development of this policy was not only necessary in order to bring the Regina Police Service in line with current national standards, but more importantly, it now provides those who have been traumatized as a victim of sexual assault crime with a supported means of reporting these typically underreported offenses. Policy itself is intentionally very victim-centered, reminding officers that their interactions and conduct with the victim plays a significant role in the victim's willingness to participate in the often stressful justice process. To provide you some context and background on the development of this new policy, I'll take you back to May of last year when I had the privilege of presenting to the board the Violence Against Women Advocate Case Review, or VACR, pilot project that had started in January of 2019 and concluded in December of 2020. My co-presenter on the pilot project at that time was Lisa Miller of the Regina Sexual Assault Center, who's become a tremendous partner and friend as we move forward through the policy development. So to quickly summarize, the project was aimed at improving police handling of sexual assault investigations through an independent third-party review of sexual assault files by victim advocates and experts outside of law enforcement. The findings were then shared with the police with the intention of championing change, improving investigations, and providing an enhanced degree of service to the victims of sexual assault. Now, I was fortunate enough to be the liaison officer on the project and can tell you that as a 22-year member with an extensive investigative background, I quickly learned valuable terms that were foreign to me as an investigator in general, such as rape culture, supported reporting, and victim-centered, trauma-informed responses. As I began to get a better understanding of these terms and concepts, they ultimately became the foundation for the policy and are evident throughout it. So supported reporting is an attempt by the police service to encourage victims to report occurrences of sexual assault. These crimes often go unreported by victims for a number of reasons, including fear of the medical, investigative, and court procedures, trauma, embarrassment, shame, loss of control, and most importantly, the fear of not being believed. Supported reporting recognizes these identified barriers and tries to reduce the stigma attached to sexual assault reporting. In order to accomplish this, we've provided clear direction to our officers in their response to victims, being attentive to our service delivery, to our service delivery goals. Focus is on the comfort, well-being, and safety of the victim, treating the victim in a respectful, kind, and empathetic manner, being non-judgmental, while remaining objective and mindful of the impact that the traumatic situation may have on the victim. Supported reporting also means providing clear communication on the process, what will happen as part of the investigation, their reporting options, support mechanisms available such as victim services and our partners at the Regina Sexual Assault Center, as well as the potential judicial process. This allows victims to make informed decisions with confidence and support. Now, rape culture is something that I was admittedly oblivious to. The term is used to describe a society or environment whose prevailing attitudes have the effect of normalizing or trivializing sexual assault and abuse. Common behaviors include victim blaming, such as, why did you go home with that person? Why did you drink so much? What did you expect wearing that outfit? Sexual objectification, often experienced by servers and waitresses in something as common as restaurants. Trivializing sexual violence. It was just a grab, touch, slap, or squeeze. Denial of widespread sexual violence, often experienced by those in the sex trade or drug subculture, and refusal to acknowledge the associated harms to all of these. We're educating our officers to this rape culture concept to ensure that no aspects of sexual assault are normalized or trivialized during our investigations. An example of this is taking careful consideration of the way victims are interviewed and questions posed to them. The question may be viewed by the victim as accusatory, what were you wearing that night? Versus a preface version of the same question. This is not to imply anything from the clothing you had on that night having anything to do with the incident that took place. I'm simply asking what you were wearing that night as part of the investigation to corroborate anything further from other witnesses, video, or possibly for evidentiary purposes. Reframing the question is valuable to the victim, and they get a better understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. Another example could be, so all he did was grab or touch your behind. This is an example of the minimizing and trivializing to a victim. The point to this is to make our officers aware of any bias they may have and to give careful consideration to the way they conduct their investigations and interviews. leads me to the most important concept, which is conducting our investigations from a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. It means providing our officers with an understanding of the neurobiological science and an evidence-based investigative approach about how specific experiences impact victim trauma, memory, reactions, and behavior. These are all unique to each individual victim and should not be judged or questioned, but understood as a trauma response. Understanding these trauma responses is imperative. Fighting off the assailant versus catatonic or disassociated. Being very upset and depressed versus emotionally numb. Remembering details versus nothing at all. This is all where the trauma-informed interviewing guideline that we use provides our officers with a strategy and a roadmap for conducting the interviews appropriately. It allows our officers the opportunity to gather the necessary information to conduct a complete and thorough investigation while remaining victim-centered. It is a balance of the victim needs to tell their story without being re-victimized and investigative necessity to gather the necessary evidence to proceed with the investigation on behalf of the police. Although our approach to these investigations has been realigned, the primary role of the police when dealing with allegations of sexual violence is still to ensure we're conducting a thorough, unbiased, and professional investigation. The investigative checklist we now use as a guide for our members and their supervisors to thoroughly navigate their way through an investigative process. The checklist was taken from the VACR evaluation process, so it remains victim-centered, but was amended to include investigative requirements as a mechanism to confirm that all investigative avenues are considered. The checklist was strongly supported by the Crown, knowing that the sexual assault files that result in charges will have the sufficient evidentiary grounds to proceed and hopefully succeed in court. With respect to training, our officers received a half-day training program that included an introduction to our policy, the VACR pilot project and findings, trauma training, interviewing, and work with our Crown prosecutors. Although training was impacted by COVID, we have developed an online version to ensure that all officers are trained to the same standard. Since the implementation of the policy, we had also come to the end of the VACR pilot project. However, both the Regina Police and the Regina Sexual Assault Centre have agreed to continue on with the partnership and continue quarterly reviews of our sexual assault reports. The process and the reviews have been so valuable as an oversight mechanism since the beginning. In speaking with the reviewers, they have already seen a marked improvement in the quality of the investigations put before them, including the interviews with the victims, and since our policy and training have been implemented, a dramatic turn in the quality of our investigations. They've seen an increase in the number of referrals of victims made to Regina sexual assault members by RPS. So we may not be taking the reports in ourselves, but at least we're making the referrals, taking care of the victims' needs. Charge rates are in its infancy right now with respect to the implementation of this policy, but they also seem to be increasing with each quarter, indicating that our officers are doing a much more thorough investigation, resulting in charges and sending them to court. All of this lends well to an overall improvement in our service delivery, especially to victims of sexual assaults, who were our primary focus with the development of the policy. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much, Staff Sergeant. Members of the Commission, this is a receive and file report, but I'd like to open it up for questions. Councillor Stevens, please go ahead.
Thank you, through the chair. Appreciate the report. You'd mentioned some of the third parties that were involved in crafting this policy. Will organizations like the Sexual Assault Center and other third-party experts intervene periodically to update the techniques to ensure that the policy is being followed? Presumably, the trauma-informed investigation techniques change over time. Just talk about how this policy might evolve as best practices change.
Well, I think that'll be incumbent upon us to continue to stay on top of trauma-informed approaches as they develop. We know it's a scientific approach. We know that they are evolving. They're learning new things as they delve deeper into the effects of trauma on an individual. And like we mentioned, they're all unique, each circumstance, each person based on their history, their culture. There's a number of factors as to how they may respond. So we're trying to impart at least a basic foundation of trauma-informed investigations and interviews and approaches to dealing with victims and witnesses. And this actually transcends across all types of investigations, not just sexual assaults. This deals with domestic, this deals with robbery, this deals with a number of offenses or occurrences that simply would have an impact on even witnesses.
Okay, thank you.
And
Next question.
Sorry, Councillor Stevens. Chief Bray would like to also make a comment.
I'm just going to add a little bit to that, Councillor. I think there's a couple of things. As Staff Sergeant Jack, you mentioned, we're continuing on, even though the pilot's done, we're continuing on by having our third-party oversight, continuing with sexual assault. So having that quarterly communication with them has and continues to prove valuable, because I can tell you that the Sexual Assault Center, for example, in Regina, and Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan very much stay on top of trends and changes to trauma-informed reporting. And so having that very integrated relationship with them on a every quarter basis is going to help with that. Not to mention that the Saskatchewan Police College has really stepped into trauma-informed investigation strategies and techniques. So trauma-informed training is now becoming part of recruit training. It's going to be in basic investigator courses. So as police investigators move through their career, they go back to the police college for upgrades on, the newest techniques with regard to investigations, for example. So I think it's safe to say that we won't regress when it comes to trauma-informed investigations. There's a whole bunch of checks and balances that are going to ensure that this will continue.
Thank you for that. If a victim, follow-up question, if a victim alleges that the RPS during the investigation did not pursue appropriate interview techniques and they went through the Public Complaints Commission, what's your understanding of how informed that review body is about the expectation of how you would investigate a sexual assault? In other words, if someone complains this policy wasn't followed, those who would look at that appeal, would they understand that the RPS is supposed to be following this kind of investigative practice and policy?
So we haven't encountered that, but I'm going to say that what I know about the Public Complaints Commission is they like any investigative body, they will gather all of the facts. And knowing now that sexual assault investigations have a component where they are reviewed by a third party, I would guess that the investigators would also talk to, for example, reviewers from the Regina Sexual Assault Center. So I can't speak knowledgeably as to whether or not the investigators with the Public Complaints Commission are trained on trauma-informed process. However, they would take the nature and the essence of the complaint, and they would do everything in their power to investigate it, including talking to all of the experts to reach a conclusion that would, either substantiate or not substantiate the complaint, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. My last question, can you comment on how this policy advances the RPS's commitment to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the calls to action in that report?
Sure, thanks. I think that's a really pertinent question, and this is something that we have talked about publicly with this step. I think this is an essential part of this. It just shows the focused attention and priority that is put on these types of calls. We know that through the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, a misproportionate number of Indigenous women and girls are victimized through sexual assaults and through various types of crimes that happen in this country. And so having this oversight, having some independence, having people that are not police officers, but rather spent in some cases over 3 decades helping survivors of sexual assaults, and dealing, predominantly with a large number of Indigenous women and girls over the years. I just think that really strengthens and furthers that commitment of our organization. We have, when we speak to not just the calls to action, but the calls to justice with the MMIW inquiry, we have referred to this VAW, Violence Against Women Advocate Case Review, as one of many steps that we've taken to further our commitment to those calls to justice. So I do believe there is a direct link to it, and there's some real positive impacts that come from it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Great policy.
Thanks, Councillor Stevens. Commissioner Yee.
Thank you so much, Your Worship. Councillor Stevens took my question about the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. First off, thank you so much for this report and for this policy. This is extremely important, to the Indigenous community as well. But I guess to further on Councillor Stevens' comment and question, I guess more of a comment on my part now, would be when it comes to the calls to justice, have you thought, especially when it comes to your third-party oversight, Section 9, specifically 9.23, for the calls to justice, talks about having Indigenous representation, maybe on this third-party oversight. Can you comment on if there is any current Indigenous participation for this third-party oversight, or maybe in the future there could be some?
I'm going to give a general comment, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Staff Sergeant Jackie as well, who has more intimate knowledge of the reviewers that have been coming in. But because it's a third party, and because there's some independence that we want to afford to them for coming in and doing this work, we don't really prescribe who the experts should be. We leave it up to the Regina Sexual Assault Center to say, here's our group of reviewing people, and here's the experience they have, which is what qualifies them to do this. Now, having said that, I know there is some diversity in the backgrounds of the people doing the review, and maybe Chris, you can speak to that.
Yeah, like the chief said, we don't actually control who does the reviews, and depending on how many files there are per quarter, they control who's available and when they're available. But as the chief identified, there is some diversity on the board or on that review committee. And it varies depending on, like I said, the number of files and who's available at the time when we're conducting the reviews. But that's typically controlled by the Regina Sexual Assault Center, who puts together the review committee.
Great. Thank you. And just as a follow-up question, I see that training is involved with this policy. Again, going back to Section 9.2-4, do you know if there's specifically some type of training when it comes to culturally appropriate, when dealing with Indigenous victims of violence?
Yeah, so this policy is actually all-encompassing, that it does take in, cultural aspects into consideration, as well as supports. It's actually written right into the policy, and the policy was developed based on the Canadian framework, which specifically identifies the missing, murdered Indigenous investigation. It actually mentions it specifically and about Indigenous women being victimized, as the chief identified. So we mirrored that policy, or took portions of it, obviously made it specific to Regina. So it actually does take a lot of that into consideration. It's in our policy. It is in the training as well that we do at the Regina Police Service.
And just to add to that, Commissioner Yee, Staff Sergeant Jack, you talked about supportive reporting off the start. I think a lot of times that supportive reporting can include, an advocate, liaison, someone from, an Indigenous, even an Indigenous elder, family member. And we see that with the Regina Sexual Assault Center, and any of the reports that come in. Oftentimes it's kind of encompassing in that supportive reporting that we referred to off the start of the report.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and great job.
Thank you, Commissioner Yee. Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you very much for the report. Just if someone comes in and would like to have a female officer, how is that request held?
Yeah, typically, if there is somebody that comes into the front desk and they do want to report something of a sensitive nature like that, our officers would take them to a private area to discuss their wants and needs and give them some information prior to even starting that report-taking process. Absolutely, if they have a gender preference, they're more than welcome to make that request, and we would see that request through.
Okay, thank you for that. How many staff do we have dedicated to this area? the sexual assault unit. The chair.
So what I'm going to say to that is it depends. You know, one of the things that I think is very, very important with regard to sexual assaults, well, let me stop for a second. We have a VICE unit, which is an investigative unit that works in investigative services that does some work on sexual assaults. We have the Regina Children's Justice Center that tends to work with children that are victimized. But with this policy and with this work, this is a case where it's impossible to have a specialized unit that only takes sexual assaults because it's our frontline patrol officers that are often that first point of contact. We're dispatched to the calls. It could be in the middle of the night. It could be on a weekend. It could be first thing in the morning. And so having all of our frontline patrol officers trained, as Staff Sergeant Jackie talked about, a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach, having them trained on rape culture and the importance of supportive reporting, really, I think, give us a good foundation to take that initial report. It may then go over to the VICE unit for further investigation or another specialized area, depending on the nuances of the case. But for the most part, that very first initial report is usually taken by a frontline patrol officer.
Okay, thank you. I guess the last question is in regards to, we have a very, very high number of domestic violence calls per day. I guess I want to ask is, how does this policy, because they're, sorry, excuse me, often connected, how would you say that this policy would enhance that work with domestic violence?
So I think, you know, Staff Sergeant Jackie talked about the trauma-informed reporting, or sorry, the trauma-informed investigative approach that we take isn't just for sexual assault files. And so I think it's safe to say that trauma-informed lens over domestic conflict is very, very important because there's lots of parallels. So first and foremost, the Regina Police Service's advancements on the sexual assault investigation policy have really, I think, enhanced our ability to respond to any of that interpersonal conflict and violence that occurs in a domestic conflict situation, regardless of whether it's a sexual assault, a common assault, or just, you know, more domestic conflict that may not result in a charge. Understanding that the victim may respond in a certain way, may not exhibit certain qualities that you would expect a victim of crime to exhibit. I think that conscious understanding of that has improved our investigative abilities and made our frontline officers much more responsive to those. So that is a general principle, I would say. But again, I think it speaks to just that deeper commitment to not only the investigations that we're doing, but links to other parts of the organization. These types of policy changes really give us an opportunity to bring together different parts of the police service, so frontline officers, along with investigative services that may have specialty training in a certain area, and find ways we can do this training. So for example, through our block training, over the couple of years while we were making this transition, Staff Sergeant Jackie was one of the presenters, along with a representative or representatives from the Regina Sexual Assault Center, but we also had representatives from our Regina Police Service VICE section who are, again, focused and specialized in sexual assault investigations. So it really, I think, brings a collaborative approach to the work that we do and helps us when it comes to domestic conflict as well.
That's great. Well, just, I guess there's another big piece to this, and I absolutely agree with the collaboration, as well as the trust, which will gain trust in the community, but the communication. So, you know, I think it's so key that I think people have to hear that it's changed within the system, and that, you know, officers are you know, it's almost so much safer now to be able to report this, that they're not going to be, women are not, or whoever is not going to be laughed at or shunned at or whatever. And I think that this is an important piece that needs to be told within our Regina Police Service. So I do appreciate this report and the focus that it goes to many officers in this training. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor Bresciani. Commissioner Bushi.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the report as well. My question is actually in line with Councillor Boshani's question, so I will try and be short here. Thank you again for the report. The last time this was brought forward, it was actually very promising, and I think and it shows in your report that the changes that have been made in the training, and I've actually heard about Dr. Laurie Haskell's training, and I see that the men also do get the 2-day training from her, and I think that's fantastic. That's just one of the many things that is good about this report. My question is, again, sort of related to Councillor's, Boshani's second question. Given that Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of, intimate partner violence or abuse or assaults, and sexual assaults is one of the many ways that women especially experience violence. My question is, based on your work and your reports that you've done, do you think we have enough, or do the victims have enough support, after care? And I don't know if the police sort of is too involved in the aftercare or the follow-up part, but I was just wondering, do you think the city of Regina, or do we have enough support for victims who come to report to you and need, still need support 3 weeks from now, or 3 months afterwards?
Yeah, I happen to be in charge of the victims services unit right now as well, so I know exactly how busy they are with violent offenses and reaching out to victims, supporting them through court processes. And that portion was also written into the sexual assault investigation policy, which was reaching out, tasking our victim services unit so that they are made aware that they can reach out to victims and communicate with them, offer services, offer support if this does reach the point of a charge or going through the court process. So our victim services unit is plugged into sexual assault investigations as well. To Councillor Bresciani's comment, and she talked about letting the public know and sharing that information. Regina Sexual Assault Centre has now put out a pamphlet as well as contact cards that they've provided to the Regina Police Service en masse for us to distribute, because if victims choose not to go through the police service or through the justice route, that we do feel that they still require support, whether that's through our victim services or through the Sexual Assault Centre. So I think that speaks to the increased referrals that they've had. Do I think there's sufficient resources? I do think that they're a tremendous resource. Are there ever enough resources? I somewhat question. I know our victim services unit does provide long-term support through files that can take up to years as they make their way through the court process on some of our more serious violent offenses that we experience in Regina. So could there be more resources? Absolutely. Are the resources there right now? Yes, and we're starting to utilize them to a better capacity right now. So I can't really speak to their work volume, but I know they're not short of things to do.
And if I can just add to what Chris is saying there, Commissioner. So the victim services area, as Chris has talked about, they really do dig into files involving sexual assaults, and they try and help people through kind of what can be a tough process to navigate, going through courts and meeting with prosecutors and that part of it. However, if it's domestic related, so if there is some sort of a domestic relationship, we also work daily, collaboratively with Family Service Regina. And so all domestic related files, whether they end in a charge or not, are referred to Family Service Regina. So they're not with our police service. That's an independent organization. And they have files where they meet regularly with families, with victims, with survivors, even with offenders, to try and find ways that they can heal that family unit. So they do a lot of incredible follow-up work, and they're a great community partner for us on the domestic related files, which include domestic related sexual assault files.
Thank you, Chief. And Mayor, I can move the motion to file if there is any.
Thank you very much. for that motion to receive and file. I'll just do one more call before I call the vote. Any other members of commission wish to ask any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for the presentation, Staff Sergeant Jackie, and the work you've done over the last number of years. This is a fantastic improvement and great things to build upon. So very much appreciate the work you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commission, I'll call the vote. We have a motion to receive and file this report. Any opposed? Seeing none, carried. Commissioner Duncan, I'm just going to let you know, because sometimes it's not obvious. I may know this from personal experience. The report number at the top references the year. So PO 22-1 would be the first police report of the year that the commission sees, and it just continues on from there. So if you're ever going to look back for reference, that's how you can find things. I'd point that out. May not have been shared with me initially. All right, Commission, the next item on the report is, agenda is PO 22-2, Community Policing Initiative Reserve. Chief, could I ask that you introduce the report?
Sure, thank you. I'm going to be turning this over to Ms. Tracy Raisin in just a second, but I will just give a couple of opening comments. So this report is coming forward based on a conversation we had at a previous board meeting. Councillor Stevens had asked a question with regard to the Community Policing Initiative, and if we had money left over in that initiative at the end of 1 year, could it be carried over in a way that we may, we may have some pressures in the next year, and it would allow us to access that money. And so I think the situation we're in right now is really a good situation to lead us into this report. 2021, we had the Community Policing Initiative that was accessed for various different initiatives. However, due to COVID, many initiatives didn't happen. 2022, we're anticipating things to hopefully continue to open up, including the hosting of a Grey Cup. So there will be many more pressures on the funding that we have in that initiative funding. And so if we had some carryover from a previous year, it might allow for the lack of interruption in the service that we provide and the funding that we can support community organizations with for the initiatives in those years where we have some pressure. So the question was posed, could you look at a way that you could work with the city so that this funding could be potentially carried over to another year? And that's the foundation for this report. So with that, and hopefully I haven't stolen all of Tracy's thunder, I'll turn it over to Tracy Raisin, who's our Manager of Financial Services, to walk us through this report.
Good morning, Mayor Masters and members of the board. I'm here to discuss the establishment of the Community Policing Initiative Reserve. In the 2020 budget, an amount of $600,000 was approved to be an ongoing operational budget expense for the community policing initiatives. So this initiative is really used to offset police overtime costs that many community groups and organizations would have to pay when required to have a police presence during their event. So unfortunately, due to COVID-19, many events were canceled last year, so not all the funding was required in 2021. So this led to a discussion with the City of Regina's executive leadership team about the surplus, and they recommended that we request a new reserve be set up. So what this reserve would do is it would allow unspent funds to be carried forward to the following year. And then that surplus will remain separate from our police general reserve. So funds in the reserves can be withdrawn in future years and used to cover police operations for community events. It is important to note that all the transfers in and out of the reserve would have to be approved by the Board of Police Commissioners first. So if approved by the board, the city will bring it forward to City Council, as this new reserve will have to be approved and added to the reserve bylaw. In conclusion, the Regina Police Service is seeking approval to set up the new Community Policing Initiative Reserve at this time. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Raisin. Commission, I need a motion. I'll be right there. Hang on a second. A motion that the Board of Police Commissioners approve the creation of the Community Policing Initiative Reserve, but we'll leave it open to questions prior to that motion if so required. Councillor Stevens, do you want to make this motion?
Yes, so moved.
Do you have any comments or questions on it?
Yeah, I do. I'm really appreciative of this. I guess the question ties into how the overarching policy would function, and then how money is distributed then into the reserve. So if we have in any given year 600,000, this year that money will be used for Grey Cup. How do we draw down that amount? So for instance, the Folk Fest, which is the cause for concern, let's say they have police overtime that amounts to about $20,000 for an event. Would they have to then apply to the RPS to access this fund? And then secondly, do we just draw this money down until it's gone in a given year, or would there be some way of anticipating future events that might come up?
Sure. So the RPS has an established application process that community groups complete prior to hosting an event in the city. So these are the events that have requires a police presence to keep it to be held safely. So we have developed this past year a framework to allocate the funding depending on a couple of scenarios. So is it a nonprofit? Is it a parade? Is it a concert? Is it exhibition? We sort of have a framework now for every type of event. And in the year of a Grey Cup, yes, there is a much more need for this. So every event is still evaluated. We have a committee now. We review it. So the same process still happens where each community group will apply. And then what happens, so for example, last year if we had surplus, we would put it in the reserve, and maybe 2022, we're gonna need that reserve plus. So every year we always get the $600,000 allocated in our budgets. We know that going in, plus the surplus now we'll have. But maybe this year we'll spend it all. But again, starting in 2023, we'll have another $600,000 to start with.
Great, thank you.
If I can just jump in, Councillor, I think as we work through this, like this is obviously new, even having the process for community organizations. It's not like we will make it very well known to them when they apply for a permit through the city. That's when they're directed to the police service in terms of potential needs. We can make it very known to them about the accessing of this fund. So there is some reliance on them to work with us on this, but it's not like if they don't apply, we wouldn't be bringing it up to them. But further to that, I think, I'm anticipating what we will have to do if this motion passes and this reserve is generated. I don't think we can have a mechanism where if the Folk Festival required a few more people and we had to access $5,000 from the reserve, that we'd have to come back to the board. I think what we would need to do is either set up at the start of the year or the end of the year a bit of a cap that we would work within, and then anything outside of that we would come back to the board. But it just wouldn't be practical for us on a monthly basis to try and get together with the board to approve even some of these small expenditures. So I think that's something that we'll still need to work through what that looks like.
Great, thank you. Last question. There's a ceiling of 1.5 million. I have no objection to the amount. Just curious how you came to that.
Sure. So that was in discussion with the city's executive leadership team. And so what we decided is in this particular example, we have the 400,000 carried forward from 2021, and we'll be receiving the 600,000. So that's at $1 million. So we were just forecasting to think if we had a couple years of surplus at 1.5 million, that would be our cap. And at that point, we would hope there would be enough events. We don't think we would ever have that much in the surplus. And sorry, just to clarify on that last question, what I do is I track all the events throughout the year. And so it wouldn't be until we've had the events and we know the expenses that we would come back to the reserve. And the plan would be at the end of the year when I do my final year-end report, that's when I ask for reserve transfers to happen. So that's likely where we would have it, is actually when we have all the actual expenses. And then it would be an annual thing to move funds in or out of the reserve.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Stevens. Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you very much. I remember when the Grey Cup, we had discussions with the Grey Cup when it was going to be here. And I thought that they actually paid Regina Police Service for the police service that they needed for that event. Can I get clarity on that?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, so for the events such as the Grey Cup, the community policing initiative would really be used for the events of the week leading up to the Grey Cup. So when a city hosts the Grey Cup, there's always community events, usually the week prior, so parades or other community events going on. But the actual Grey Cup, yes, what would happen is the Saskatchewan Roughriders, their CFL, they usually pay for the in-stadium costs. So of basically the public safety unit working the crowd control in the stadium. But what this initiative would do would be to help with the community events leading up to it.
Okay. I would agree that the criteria needs to be clear as to how one would apply it. And I'll give you an example, would be the Frost Festival coming up here. Again, what does that look like? I guess how is time calculated? Like that's always, is it after the fact or how, like, I don't know how that would work.
So
Sure.
Can I just jump in? Because and this is, I'm going to let the chair talk to this, but this is a bit off topic. So the discussion around, like today's motion is around the reserve. We have worked with the city on a whole criteria around how you access the fund. And I'm happy to talk a bit about that, but it's not, like, I don't think that's what we're deciding today. So I'll leave that up to you, Chair, if you want me to get into.
Thanks, Chief. Councillor Bresciani, I think they had, there was opening discussion about the fact that the policy relative to the application and how they're going to administer, et cetera, they're going to continue to work on that. This is about creating the reserve fund itself.
Yeah, I understand that. I just, the whole piece that I'm trying to understand is that policy and how it's written and the application works also, I think, is I guess I would say very, very important to understand when we set up a reserve. And that's my only, and I'll take that if it's still being worked out. But again, I want to be clear that if we're setting up a reserve to do community policing, I just want to make sure that it balances off when we actually get paid for events that, like the Grey Cup and other events that we do charge for.
Certainly. Okay. And I think since policy is being worked on, the $600,000 is already approved as an ongoing budget item for this type of initiative. So this particular motion is dealing with the surplus going into a specific reserve. And I think Chief will circle back around at some point in time relative to the policy of the process. Is that fair, Chief?
Sure, we can. Dean, I'm wondering if Deputy Chief Ray has any comments on this, because he's been very involved in setting up, again, how we look at this. The intent is that, let's say, for example, in this year where we have a Grey Cup, that $600,000 gets swallowed up. With the benefit of the reserve, things like the Frost event, the folk festival, any other events that are happening in the city won't have to go without funding, and we would be able to access that reserve to ensure that there's kind of a seamless transition through those years where there's heavy and extra pressures. But Dean, do you have any comments on kind of the specifics of accessing that fund?
Sure. I'll maybe walk through a bit of the process on how those funds are available and the process to apply for even the permit piece. So when a group decides to have an activity, whether it's Frost or the Sikh Parade, they put an application into the city. And we review those applications and have a number of criteria in place to help us provide the appropriate policing response for those things. So Canada Day, Sikh Parade, completely different types of events. It required a different level of policing, and we provide that based on what we see and how we think it's going to impact our community. So with this community policing initiative, we put some parameters around the funding that's available and what we would provide those groups. And no different than the riders. We're looking at what the impact is to the community and what we can do to support it, and then we fund it, or we provide our policing resources appropriately. We think with this community policing initiative and the money that's attached to it, that we will be able to fund most of these things that impact our community, whether it's a folk festival or the Sikh Parade or the Canada Day, and we provide it based on the impact to the community, what it does for the community. So we'll be able to hopefully provide a policing presence, and most of that money that's required for that could come from the community policing initiative on most years. And that's the hope with these things. With the riders, it's a bit differently. They will always pay for in-house policing in the stadium. But let's say we look at the rider games now, what we've decided is the policing required for outside the stadium to ensure the safe influx of people into the stadium and the exit afterwards will likely be covered through the community policing initiative, because it's part of our responsibility. But anything in the stadium will be the riders. And with the QCX, we provide a level of service there as well. So there's a number of criteria that we'll look at to make it fair and equitable for all in our community, and hopefully be able to support the small ones and support the large ones to maybe a similar extent. But we'll make sure that we're fair as we work through this. And like the chief has mentioned, this process is new to us. We've got it established within in our building, and we'll continue to work for it and look for efficiencies, and just to ensure that fairness is there for everybody that applies for this. But it's part of the process that when individuals apply for a permit, we review those and make determinations based on the level of police support for those community initiatives. I don't know if that helps you out.
Yeah, that's excellent, actually. Thank you. I like the term fair and equitable for all. That's great. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bresciani. Any other members of commission wish to ask any questions about the creation of this reserve? Seeing none, we have a motion on the floor to approve this. Any opposed? Oh, I apologize. Caitlin Duncan. Commissioner Duncan, please go ahead.
Hi, yes, good morning. Sorry to jump in there at the end. Just so I kind of understand correctly, there's no consideration given to an organization's ability to pay? That's completely aside from the application process. And then the other question I had was, with this policing initiative reserve, is there any strategic objectives set out as to, obviously the impact on the community is considered, but various groups, certain target audiences, certain geographical regions of the city. Is that something that is going to be considered going forward? And I know obviously last year the fund was under budget, but going forward, is that going to be something that will be considered?
Thanks. Knowing that this is part of the policy that you have yet to develop, are you prepared to answer that today?
I think Deputy Chief Ray can answer it for sure, the first part of that question.
Okay,
Yeah.
Deputy Chief Ray?
Yeah, as far as the ability to pay, that definitely is factored into it. If we're looking at a community event where they have a beer gardens or they're selling alcohol and they're making money from this, that definitely has an impact on first of all, the level of policing services that are required for this, and then how much that community group may end up paying as a result of that. So that's taken into consideration. If they're making money out of this, it won't be necessarily free policing services. It'll be a level of service that will be provided that we think is necessary to ensure the safety. And also they usually have a security component attached to it as well, where they have to provide a level of security on their own outside of the policing services as well. As far as your other question, it's going to be a bit of a challenge to answer that at this point in time until we see the nature of all the requests that come through. We do see a wide variety of different events that happen throughout the city on a normal year. And I'm assuming as we get back to normal, as COVID ends, we'll see more of a return to that. And then we'll take all those requests into consideration as we move this forward.
So,
thank you.
If could I just jump
Chief,
in?
Just a second.
Sorry.
Commissioner Duncan, I think your second part of your question in terms of the strategic initiative is actually tied to the creation of the fund in the first place, which is there's $600,000 set aside on a recurring basis in budget. So can you explain why that was created, Chief?
Sure, I will, and I'm just going to add a little bit to that first one as well. But the reality is this is about the city and the police service showing a commitment to community and community events. We know that having events in the community and you know, really promoting this is a positive thing for the community. It allows for people to have different experiences. And so one of the challenges, and this is the part that I was going to supplement on what the deputy talked about, one of the challenges is you'll have a wide variety of different types of events that'll happen. So if we use the Sikh Parade as an example, the Sikh Parade on a normal non-COVID year could have 3,000 people walking in a parade through city streets. You can't have that happen without getting permits and closing down roads. And there's a fairly significant need for police to be present to shut down roads, direct traffic, and those types of things. And so knowing that we staff on a basis that allows us to handle day-to-day events, but when we have a big event happening in the city, it's not as simple as just saying, well, we'll just take some of the officers that are working and put them there. There's the need to bring in officers to specifically handle that parade, because we can't have them called away from it. If an emergency call comes in, they have to be assigned to just do that work. So in the case of a Sikh Parade, you know, it's not a big fundraiser. They're not raising a lot of money. It's a community event where the City of Regina and the police service want to show their commitment. And so having 6 officers come in and do traffic control for the 2 hours that the parade winds through the city and ends up at Wascana Park, that's something that we're able to do. The flip side of that is an event, and this is what the deputy was referring to a few years ago. We had a large X Games event happening in Wascana Park, where they had events on the water, events on the land. They had a couple of big beer gardens, and we had 20,000 people in the park. You can't have an event organizer say, we want a permit for this event, but we don't need any security or police. It'll be fine. We know that's not the case, and we know that there's a need to have that security on site, no different than at a Rider game, for the patrons to feel comfortable that police are there and that there isn't going to be, you know, a risk to their safety while they're participating in the event. So it takes away the ability for an organizer to say, we're hosting this event, we're having beer gardens, we're expecting this size of crowd, but yet we don't want police or security there. And so it's the commitment from the city to the citizens of Regina that there is a balance there, and we need to be able to provide this balance. So in terms of strategy, we've worked with the city in terms of their community grants area to really kind of use the philosophy and the pillars that they use and how they hand out their community grants. And that really will augment the work that we do, because we're only a small part of it. Everybody that applies for or will be accessing our initiative have gone to the city first to initiate the process to get a permit. And so that permitting system, whether there's hundreds of events that happen in a year, but they all go through the city and then the police service to ensure that we're aligned in our efforts. And so that's where the strategic efforts are in place to ensure that it encompasses the whole city, that it is open and equal access to different size of groups, different structures of organizations that might be applying for this. It's fairly new. This is only a year old, this funding. So as you have heard, in the first year, we didn't come close to spending it. This may be something that will evolve a little bit more, and we may have to develop policy to adjust based on complications that we see in future years. But right now, that's how it's set up and structured.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Commissioner Duncan. Seeing no further questions coming from the commission, I'll call the vote. Any opposed to approval of the motion before you? That would be none. Carried. Moving on to the public agenda, next are PO 22-3 and PO 22-4, which are the monthly crime statistics for November and December. Chief, I'm going to ask that you, of course, introduce these two reports, understanding that November is now somewhat redundant as it's reflected in December numbers, but please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mayor Masters. So yeah, at the end of every year, there's a bit of a reconciliation process that happens with our numbers. So typically in the December board meeting, we don't have a stats report, which means in January, we give you the one that would have been presented in December, and then the one for the end of the year. So I won't spend a lot of time on PO 22-3, other than to say at the end of November, we were seeing an overall crime increase or crime rate increase, crimes against person and crimes against property of 2%, and that's over 2020. So I will, though, flip to the PO 22-4 report, which is monthly crime stats as of the end of December 2021. So this will be our report that shows us where we ended the year after a full year. And, you know, I think we talked about this through the year a few different ways, but 2020 was really an anomaly across Canada. We saw crime rates plummet in some categories and significantly increase in others because of COVID. Behaviors changed. We saw people working from home, staying home, stores were closed, businesses were not operating. And so we saw some real swings in crime trends. 2021 stats were not a complete return to normal, but there was a bit of a hybrid. We were returning people to work, restaurants and businesses were open, maybe in some sort of a restricted fashion. And so I think what we saw was a slight increase overall in stats, reflecting again, human behavior and what we were seeing in our community. So as of the end of December, crimes against property showed an increase of 2.2% over the year before. That's 229 more reported incidents through the whole year. And the crimes against the person saw an increase of 1.8%, and that was 54 incidents more reported over 2020. So it shows us that overall we ended the year with a 2.1% increase overall when you combine crimes against property and crimes against person, which, although it's an increase, I think I can say we were happy to see it wasn't more sharp and increased than that, given the fact that 2020's drop was so sharp, and that again was consistent across Canada. If we flip to the back of this stats report, again, we've got the templates there and the dashboards for you to look at. Tragic story with regard to drug overdoses. We ended the year with 1,800 overdoses that were reported. So that number we know is significantly higher because a lot of overdoses go unreported when they've got someone in their presence that can administer Narcan, and oftentimes emergency services aren't called at all. About 10% of those overdoses resulted in death. So this is a topic that we've obviously talked about a lot with the board and will be continued focus of efforts, not just by our police service, but other organizations in the city at various different levels to try and address this problem going forward. The daily dashboard, if we flip to that, right at the end of the package, it's the last page in that report. It's got our daily averages there. So on average, we took 19 domestic conflict calls per day. We took 3 missing people per day. We took 3 suicide calls a day, and we did 2 drug seizures a day on average through the year 2021. So it just gives a little bit of daily context to the volume of work that we do and how consistent that is. If you look at those monthly graphs, how consistent it is through the year. We do see a little bit of spikes and decreases, but for the most part, there's some consistency there through the year. So that's the end of the report, and that gives us our year-end report in terms of stats for 2021. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm sorry?
Commission, we'll get year-end numbers kind of by end of Q1 or within Q1, probably more towards March. But for now, this is the discussion about December. Any members of the commission have any questions for the executive?
I don't have any questions, but I can move both reports.
Thank you very much. I have a mover. Seeing no questions. Any opposed to the receive and file? Hearing none, carried. Can I have a motion for private session, please?
Bresciani.
Thank you, Councillor Bresciani. I saw you, Councillor Bitther, there with your hand up. I'll take that as you were also willing to move a motion. But in any event, we're going to recess for 15 minutes. I'll see you back here at 10:22. Thank you.